Welcome back. Today we explore the extraordinary lives and incredible adaptability of medieval peasants. They were everyday heroes who managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal winter nights in history, against all odds. From their homemade insulation techniques to their communal sleeping strategies, their stories are a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and determination. Before you set off tonight, try dimming the lights, perhaps turning on a fan to a gentle hum, and relaxing together. When you think of medieval life, you might think of glittering jousting nights, lavish feasts, and bustling markets. But for the average peasant, winter was not a time of celebration, but a time of one question: how to survive the night. It's not just a season, but an annual test of endurance, like a particularly cruel teacher who doesn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You live in a tiny hut made of mud and twigs, with walls so thin you can hear a bird sneeze outside. There's no insulation, no windows, except for a small hole covered with animal skin, and certainly no sibling battles over the temperature control. The temperature inside your house is usually only a few degrees warmer than the weather outside. If it's freezing outside, the inside has the politeness to be a little less freezing. Congratulations. Winter nights are your worst nightmare. Darkness envelopes everything. The wind howls like angry ghosts, and the fire in the fireplace flickers miserably, trying its best, but mostly warming the toes of the person sitting closest. If you're on the other side of the room, sorry, you can consider yourself camping outdoors, but with worse food. Clothing doesn't help much either. Peasants don't own fancy fur coats or goose-down duvets. You have a few shabby woolen sweaters, maybe a cloak that smells suspiciously like goat, and a faint hope that wearing multiple layers will turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it doesn't really work. As for snuggling under a soft duvet, forget it. Beds are usually nothing more than sacks. You continue background and harshness of medieval winter. Great. Next, we'll delve deeper into the harsh landscape that medieval peasants faced every time winter came knocking. This wasn't just a regular cold. It was an annual trial of life and death. As we said before, picture your shelter, a tiny hut made of mud and twigs, what historians politely call a wattle and daub structure. That is, wooden slats are woven crisscrossed like a giant basket, then plastered with a delicious mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, animal dung. They don't mean to make it horrible. Dung is a cheap adhesive, a makeshift insulator, and is readily available. These walls, no matter how well plastered, don't stand a chance against a real winter storm. The bitter cold finds every crack, every crevice, and happily seeps into the one-room house, swirling around and ensuring you never get too comfortable. There's no proper insulation. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not much, really. Building resilience? Absolutely. Thatched roofs looked nice, but after a few months of rain and snow they sagged, leaked, and occasionally allowed local wildlife to break in. And windows? If they had any, they were tiny and often covered with thin animal skins or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even lords could barely afford a pane, and peasants were glad if the wind didn't blow a cowhide off in the middle of a blizzard. Plus, the floors were often just hard-packed earth. When rain or snow fell heavily, mud would seep back through the ground, so you could technically say they had indoor water facilities, but not in the way they wanted it in the winter. Every step in your own home could be like wading through a frozen swamp. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-pronged assault on your core temperature. This cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and simply freezing to death are constant threats, especially for young children and the elderly. Waking up every morning still breathing is considered a minor miracle and is indeed worth celebrating, perhaps with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. As I said before, clothing doesn't help much either. You have a few shabby old sweaters, maybe a cloak that smells suspiciously like goat, and it's a slim hope that wearing layers will turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it doesn't really work. And forget about snuggling under a soft duvet. Beds were often nothing more than sacks. If you thought the mud and twig hovel was bad enough, look at the floor. Medieval floors weren't made of wood or tiles. No, they were usually just hard-packed earth inside the house. When it rained or snowed heavily, the mud would seep up through the ground. Technically, you could say they have indoor water facilities, but certainly not in the way they would like in the winter. Every step in your own home can feel like wading through a frozen swamp. The cold doesn't just come from the walls or the roof. It's a silent enemy lurking from below, creeping up from the frozen ground. It creeps through the straw, if there is any, and right into your bones, even your soul. If you drop anything on the floor on a winter night, congratulations, it's now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this bitter battle from the ground. One way was to line their floors with thick sheets of straw. If you were rich enough, or more practically stole enough straw from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you could have some decent insulation. But straw flattens, molds, and adds an unpleasant crackling soundtrack to an already miserable night. Some homes replace it with bundles of dried rushes. Occasionally, they spread a new layer on top without removing the old one. Over time, this creates a fascinating ecosystem of decaying plants, fleas, and whatever mysterious creatures decide to move in. It's like medieval carpeting, but slightly damp, smelling like wet dog, and alive. And as for beds, forget about memory foam or soft springs. Beds in the medieval peasant world were often just a crude wooden frame, if you were lucky enough to have one, topped with a large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No cozy quilts. Instead of a soft mattress, you had layers of lumpy material that shifted, creaked, and occasionally poked at you. They did little to protect against the cold that surrounded you from below. Plus, fleas, lice, and other nasty critters loved straw beds. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were living the real Middle Ages. Add to that the faint scent of barns and regrets. The truth is, tossing and turning in bed at night wasn't about finding a comfortable position. It was a paralyzing and clumsy dance to keep your blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. You literally slept with just a layer of insulation between your back and the cold ground. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. If you could do that, hey, you were doing better than most. Despite all the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. These straw or rush piles provided vital insulation against the frozen ground, and huddled together on them created shared pockets of body heat. This was the ultimate medieval central heating system. It was a constant battle against the bitter cold from all sides, from the walls, from the roof, and especially from the ground. But was fighting the cold enough to survive those brutal winter nights? There's more to it than meets the eye. In the harsh landscape we've outlined, flimsy walls made of mud and twigs, floors made of frozen clay, and beds made of straw sacks, the hearth was more than just a place to cook. It was the only real defense against the bitter cold, the all-consuming darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. Forget the image of a fancy stone fireplace with a neat chimney. The centerpiece of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire pit or pile of stones. Half a dozen logs lay burning, and enough smoke filled the room to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into a smoked ham. Yes, most homes didn't even have chimneys. The smoke just tried its best to escape through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or straight into your lungs if it's feeling lazy that night. This certainly isn't ideal for breathing or longevity in general, but on the other hand, it does a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? A fire isn't just a heat source. It's a kitchen, a light source, and sometimes a medieval version of television. People gather around it to tell stories, gossip, or just stare at the flickering flames, because let's be honest, after the sun goes down, there's not much else to do. Keeping the fire alive isn't just a good idea, it's a must. Letting it die out at night is like hanging a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, rekindling a fire in the winter isn't as easy as striking a match. You wrestled with flint, steel, tinder, and more prayers than ever before. Every member of the household had a duty: fanning the fire, tending the embers, adding peat, twigs, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human perseverance and the suffocating cold that sought to extinguish life. The fire did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival was almost impossible. It It was a small, smoky flame, often extinguished and often disappointing. But in the medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. Medieval peasants feared the fire going out overnight more than anything else, save for running out of beer. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after the harvest. Rekindling a fire on a bitter winter night was not only inconvenient, it could be fatal. Matches did not exist, lighters were a dream. To start a fire again, you had to bang flint and steel together, pray for a single precious spark, and then caress that spark with tender love and whatever dry tinder you hadn't burned off in days. Imagine trying to do all this in the cold dark, half asleep with numb fingers. So farmers learned to bank the fire, not to put money in a cozy bank. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a pile of ash just before going to bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing embers and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could walk up at sunrise, poke the ash, add fresh wood, and voila, the fire was burning again without numb fingers. But if you did it wrong, well, the morning would be much colder and much grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child, like a treasured family recipe. Proximity to the fire also determined where people slept. The closer to the fire, the better the chances of waking up without freezing. That meant that sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference than strategic placement. Babies, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail were given the best spots, closest to the fire. Parents, older children, and stronger adults were spread out, like human insulation. Being assigned a spot near the fire wasn't just a kindness, it was basic survival. Babies were fragile heat generators, and the elderly were treasure troves of family knowledge and the best gossip. Protecting them with the main source of heat was non-negotiable. But lying near the fire wasn't always comfortable. Too close, and you risked waking up with singed hair or a suspiciously smoldering robe. Too far, and you might as well be camping in a freezer. It's a delicate dance, close enough to keep warm, but not so close that you have to explain to the neighbors why you now look like a half-cooked steak. The fire doesn't radiate evenly, either. It mostly roasts those sitting directly in front of it, while everyone else struggles to grab the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling for the sun's rays. If you're lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one side of you comfortably warm and one side so cold you could knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, crowd in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to the open flame. Chickens sometimes perch precariously on the stones of the hearth, cackling softly at night like little furry guardians of warmth. Each crackle of wood, each shift of embers, was a small promise. You were still alive, you were still warm, at least for now. And so the peasants fell into a restless sleep, lulled by the crackle and hiss of the fire, each breath making little clouds in the cold air outside the fragile circle of the fire. It was imperfect, it was uncomfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth within the glowing embers. Great. Continuing the story of the hearth, the heart of the medieval home, we will delve deeper into two other survival strategies, perhaps even more fragrant and more intimate: co-sleeping and animals as portable heaters. If the hearth is the heat center, then humans and animals are the supplementary, and sometimes primary, heat sources in the fight against the cold. When the cold wind whistles through flimsy mud walls and the fire only warms a small corner, the principle of the more the merrier is not just about socializing. It is a winter survival tactic. Co-sleeping. Forget the idea of privacy or a good night's sleep. On the coldest nights, the goal is not comfort, but not waking up frozen to the floor. The entire household would huddle in the warmest corner of the house, wrapping themselves in whatever rags they could find and forming what might be called a desperate snore lasagna. Sleeping arrangements were less a matter of personal preference than strategic positioning. Younger children were squeezed between their parents, with grandparents clustered under the outermost layer. Infants, the elderly, or the sick were given prime real estate, that is, closest to the fire. This was more than just kindness, it was basic survival calculus. Infants were fragile heat generators, and the elderly were treasure troves of family knowledge, and sometimes experienced keepers of the fire. Protecting them with the primary heat source was a given. Parents and stronger adults spread out around them, forming insulating layers of human heat. Being assigned a spot in the middle, where warmth radiated from all sides, was a blessing. If you happen to be on the edge, it's like camping next to a freezer door. This closeness creates warmth, but it also creates discomfort. Personal space is non-existent. Beds are usually just sacks stuffed with straw or hay, sometimes with a few bundles of old rushes for extra support. They deflate quickly, get moldy easily, and attract all sorts of mysterious creatures. You end up with a living, damp mat that smells like wet dog. Even beds with wooden frames don't help much, as they're still just layers of straw that rustle, shift, and poke. Turning isn't for comfort. It's a clumsy, desperate dance to keep the blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of the body. Hygiene isn't a priority. With bedding made of straw and washing clothes in the middle of winter a torture, breaking ice from streams, and waiting 2 days for the only shirt to dry. If it didn't freeze first, body odor, smoke, and animals created a unique aromatic blend. But in a genius way, the dirt and grease that accumulated on clothes served as insulation, like a medieval Gore-Tex coat, only much more smelly. Survival was more important than smelling good. The long winter nights huddled together were not just about physical warmth, but also about family bonding, storytelling, singing, and, of course, great conversations under a shared wool blanket. Animals as housemates and hearths. If you thought sharing a room with someone else was challenging enough, medieval peasants were happy to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little body heat. Bringing livestock into the house wasn't just a weird tradition, it was vital to survival. Livestock provided warmth, and in a poorly insulated hut where the wind howled louder than a hungry stomach, every extra degree mattered. Also, if your goat slept on the same wall as you, it was a little less likely to be stolen by a neighbor in the middle of the night. At night, the house became a living hearth of chaos. Chickens slept in corners or old baskets. Pigs snorted near the fire, and cows relaxed luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud as if they were paying rent. This wasn't glamorous, quite the opposite. The smell becomes legendary over time. By spring, the scent of a winter spent together is something of a raging affair. You don't need to light a candle. Your nostrils are already on a wild adventure. However, medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they understood an unpleasant truth. The more animals in the house, the fewer frostbitten toes in the morning. The largest and warmest animals, like cows, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer for their warmth. Of course, sharing a bedroom with livestock wasn't without its risks. Imagine sleeping peacefully and being rudely awakened by a chicken that decided your hair was a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious as soon as you woke up in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Yet despite the noise, the smell, and the occasional kick in the ribs by a hoof, peasants understood the etiquette of a little simple. Cold kills and cows cuddle, whether they like it or not. In the battle against the winter chill, the warm, slightly viscous breath of a cow is often the deciding factor between life and death. In short, in the medieval winter, survival required giving up comfort and privacy, huddling together in groups to seek warmth from any source possible, whether it was the dying embers of a fire, the physical warmth of relatives and neighbors, or the pungent smells and warmth of cattle friends crowded into the house. It was a harsh, imperfect life, but that was how they clung to life, through perseverance, strategy, and a spirit willing to take on anything to see the sun rise in the morning. Wonderful. After exploring the warmth of the fire, the warmth of sleeping together, and even the warmth of animal companions, we will continue our journey through the medieval winter with another equally important, and perhaps less savory, aspect: clothing and the fight against insanitation. If you imagine medieval clothing as being about lavish dresses or luxurious fur-trimmed cloaks, for the average peasant, the reality was quite different. The fight against the cold was not about fashion, but about not freezing to death. The rules were simple. If you owned something, you wore it, sometimes all at once. Clothing. Peasant clothing consisted mainly of coarse woolen tunics, perhaps a linen undershirt, which was certainly not very clean, underneath, and 1 or 2 thicker woolen tunics over it. Add to that wide-legged leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cape thrown over your shoulders, and, if you were extremely lucky, a patched sheepskin over your head. It all made for a thick, itchy outfit that made you look like a human onion or a clumsy laundry bag. Fancy footwear was out of the question. Many people simply wrapped their feet in old rags or cloth, then stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still got through, you just added another rag and prayed that you didn't lose a toe. Small items like simple woolen hats, scarves, and homemade gloves were treasures, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than fashion. Children were wrapped up until they looked like overstuffed turnips. The ultimate goal was to retain as much precious body heat as possible. Style or elegance? Never heard of it. Warmth was the real class mark of the Middle Ages. Hygiene, or tactical lack thereof. In this harsh climate, hygiene was not a priority. Beds made of straw or hay often came with uninvited company like fleas and other mysterious creatures. Washing clothes in the middle of winter was a torture. Imagine having to carry your clothes to a frozen stream, break the ice, and then wait 2 days for your only shirt to dry, if it hadn't frozen into a tragic shirt cycle first. So most sensible peasants decided that smelling like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing into a block. What's interesting, and a little creepy, is that the dirt and grease that accumulates on clothes has an additional function: insulation. That grime locks in body heat. It's like a medieval Gore-Tex, only much smellier. Dirt isn't just something you rub off. It's actually a tactical, even genius, survival tool. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, are surprisingly bad at keeping you warm because they're so breathable. When the outside temperature is somewhere between hypothermia and immediate regret, breathability isn't what you want. Over time, the dirt, natural body oils, and mud that cling to your clothes fill in the tiny gaps in the fabric, making them more windproof. It's like a medieval weatherproofing, only much smellier. The source says that some medieval people even believed that bathing too often in the winter could make you sick. It's better to keep that sacred barrier of dirt intact. Bathing was rare, washing was even rarer, and soap, if any, was reserved for special occasions. Farmers often wore new clothes on top of last month's old clothes. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, with each stain telling a hero story. To outsiders, they may have given up on hygiene, but they knew better. That dirty, filthy robe was a heat shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell good. And in a world where literally everyone reeked, you didn't offend anyone. A nose smells was almost a way of life. So in the medieval winter, dirtiness was not a failure. It was fashionable, it was functional. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer in February, you were a winner in life. In short, in the medieval winter, clothing was a crude armor against freezing, and hygiene was a luxury that was put aside in favor of survival. The dirt and stench were not just byproducts of harsh living, but also an unexpected survival strategy, turning their bodies and clothes into mobile fortresses of heat. Wonderful. Continuing the scented life of medieval peasants with clothing and hygiene, we now move on to another equally challenging aspect: mending houses, or rather, the never-ending battle against drafts and cold from within one's own home. If you imagine medieval houses as sturdy stone houses, the reality for peasants was quite different. Their houses are often politely referred to by historians as wattle and daub structures, roughly translated as twigs and mud. Imagine a giant basket woven from twigs and sticks, then plastered with a seductive mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, animal dung. They didn't mean to be disgusting, but dung was a cheap, sticky, and readily available insulator. But these walls, no matter how carefully plastered, didn't stand much of a chance against a real winter storm. The cold finds every crack and every hole, dancing happily through the one-room house. The thatched roofs look nice, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sag, leak, and sometimes let in local wildlife. Windows, if any, are tiny and are often covered with flimsy animal skins or wooden doors. The floors are usually just rammed earth. When it rains or snows heavily, mud seeps up from the ground, making you feel like you're wading through a frozen swamp right inside your house. In this makeshift wind furnace, the farmers don't complain. They make patching up an art of survival. The fight against the cold is not only fought outside, but also inside their homes, with only what they can fit into the cracks. Here's how they went about patching up their homes. Fixing drafts and cracks. Walls were warping, mud plaster was peeling, thatched roofs were sagging. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night. To cope, peasants stuffed all sorts of things into the cracks: moss, straw, old rags, bundles of hay, and sometimes even animal hair if they could find something soft and insulating. Fortifying the walls. Some of the more determined would plaster the outside of their houses with thicker layers of mud and animal dung as an annual winter project. It was like a kind of medieval weatherproofing. Taking care of leaky roofs. Thatched roofs were cheap and readily available, but not completely waterproof. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with rags, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of real desperation, with clumps of grass from nearby fields. Gradually, each house began to look like a sad patchwork quilt that someone had given up on halfway. Covering doors and windows. If they were lucky enough to have doors or windows, they were often just rough wooden planks. Window openings were often covered with animal skins or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst of the drafts and add a mysterious meaty smell to the living space. Covering the cold from the floor. The hard-packed earth floor was cold, and the cold seeped up from the ground like a wicked little ghost. One method was to spread thick straw mats on the floor, or, more commonly, to spread hay, rushes, over the dirt. Occasionally, fresh hay would be added on top without removing the old layer. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decaying plants, fleas, and other mysterious creatures, like medieval linoleum, only alive, slightly damp, and smelling like wet dog. While uncomfortable, these layers of straw or hay provided vital insulation against the frozen ground. It wasn't a complicated fix, but a constant battle between human ingenuity and the persistent, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next a sudden gust of wind found the spot you'd missed. Yet, with their ingenuity, stubbornness, and refusal to accept that frostbite was permanent, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and plastered their way through the harshest winters. Their efforts to patch up their homes with moss, straw, and mud are a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. Following on from the harsh lives and efforts to patch up their homes to withstand the cold, we'll look at another medieval peasant survival strategy, one that may sound strange today, but was incredibly effective: sleeping in shifts. When the biting cold was enough to keep you awake, medieval peasants had a solution method. Don't try to get everyone to sleep at the same time. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that would make any military general respect today: sleeping in shifts. This wasn't some grand, well-organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was much simpler and more desperate. About half the family would stay up to tend the fire and patch up any sneaky drafts. The other half would huddle under frayed blankets and straw, trying to catch a few precious hours of sleep in the half-freezing cold. The fire in the hearth needed constant attention. If left alone, it would die out. And rekindling a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. It required flint, pokers, tinder, and more prayers than ever. So someone had to patrol the embers. And since no one wants to wake up once they've warmed up, families rotate shifts. You might doze for a few hours, then be elbowed awake, then stumble over to the fireplace to poke the coals, stir the ashes, and curse the fire to get it going again, all while trying not to step on a goat. There's nothing glamorous about this rotation. There are no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no sleep for 5 more minutes alarms. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and increasing annoyance at the loudest snorer on your shift. Kids old enough to hold a stick are put to work, too, learning early that in winter, everyone has to pitch in or freeze to death trying. Grandparents sometimes stay by the fire longer, partly because of experience and, frankly, because arthritis makes lying down and getting up a big event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving around, animals scurrying, wind banging against the walls, and the occasional nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard. Getting any quality sleep was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant there was always a pair of cold but reluctant eyes and hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers were preserved, and so were the family. It was a constant battle to buy a few more precious hours of warmth. Waking up to find even a few embers left was a victory for you, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. So the next time you grumble about having to get up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, think about the medieval peasant squinting into a smoky fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important. Great, we've covered clothing and hygiene, patching up houses, and the medieval peasant's shift sleeping strategies. Now let's dive into another, smaller, but equally important aspect of survival: breathing techniques. You know, when the cold is so bitter that you have to think about how you inhale and exhale just to survive, that's when you're living the life of a medieval peasant in winter. They didn't just fight the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted their inhalation and exhalation to survive the night. The problem is simple: taking a deep, open-mouth breath pulls icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia can kill you faster than you can pray, that's a risk no one wants to take. So farmers have learned what you might call the art of survival breathing. Instead of taking in big gulps of air like you've just run a marathon, they keep their breath shallow, slow, and, most importantly, through their noses. The idea is to warm the incoming air a little before it reaches the lungs. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than coughing yourself to death in February. If you happen to take a big gulp of cold air through your mouth, congratulations, you've just bought yourself a ticket to a week of coughing up your soul, with no doctor nearby, and only your grandmother to treat you with hot onion tea and constant prayers. Some people are more careful. They tucked a piece of their cloak, shawl, or rag over their face while they slept, creating a makeshift barrier to warm their breath. Of course, this also meant waking up the next morning with a damp, slightly soggy piece of cloth stuck to their mouth, but it did help prevent freezing from the inside. These tricks were taught to children from a very early age. Parents would scold their children for panting like dogs in the house during the cold months. And honestly, between the strict breathing lessons, the itchy layers of wool, and sleeping next to a goat that sniffed vigorously, the medieval peasant's winter childhood was a whole other level of character building. At night, curled up in straw, under layers of cloaks, and next to a cow that radiated gentle warmth, breathing became into an art form, slowly, steadily, with just your nose, and as minimally as possible. Like a hardcore medieval version of yoga, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In that great survival manual, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. With each shallow breath, the peasant endured another night in the long, relentless battle against winter. That's right. After learning about how medieval peasants coped with the cold through clothing, shelter, sleep, and even breathing techniques, we're going to explore another survival weapon, one that may not be flashy but is incredibly effective: diet. You know, when you're struggling to stay alive, food isn't just about filling your stomach or enjoying the taste. In the harsh battle for survival of the medieval peasantry in winter, food was fuel, a source of internal heat to combat the bitter cold. As the cold wind whistled through the walls of earth and straw, one of the best ways to ward it off was to stuff your belly with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories equal warmth. The more your body has to digest, the more it heats itself up in the process. It was a basic law of medieval thermodynamics. Eat a big meal, create internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, you'll make it to the morning without turning into a peasant popsicle. So what did medieval peasants put in their stomachs before a long, cold winter night? Think thick stews with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and turnips. Grains were also a savior: oatmeal, barley porridge, or thick, chewy rye bread. If you were particularly lucky, say after a festive day or a generous butchery, you might have an extra piece of ham or a slice of dried sausage added to the stew. This was not comfort food in the modern sense. There was no elaborate presentation, no fancy decorations. It was a huge, smoky brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you a little warmer. The key was not just to eat a lot, but to eat smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady stream of warmth. Fatty foods were especially prized, not only for the energy they provided, but also because fat burned more slowly than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a dubious amount of lard was the height of luxury in a medieval winter. Parents made sure even the pickiest of children ate a lot. No one cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You had to eat them, or you'd shiver all night thinking about how much you missed them. It was harsh, but effective medieval parenting. Of course, eating big at night comes with its own risks. You might be warmer, but you also risk having a weird, vivid dream night as your stomach struggles to process enough cabbage to feed an entire field. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, farmers aren't aiming for a Michelin-starred meal, they're aiming for survival. And if that means going to bed with a full, bloated stomach and breathing softly through your nose next to a cow that's radiating warmth, then it's just another night in the never-ending quest to see the cold dawn again. Even breakfast might just be a slightly less frozen turnip. They also had creative ways of harnessing the heat from their food. Before electric blankets or heating pads, medieval peasants used hay boxes. They used sturdy wooden boxes lined with straw. Cooked food, such as stews or hot porridge, would be placed in the box and sealed. The straw acted as an insulator, keeping the food warm for hours. It was a kind of medieval slow cooker, allowing them to have a late-night snack without risking the risk of rekindling the fire. And during particularly harsh winters, communities would share their food supplies. They would pool their leftover salted meats, grains, and dried vegetables. Even if no one had much, a few shared meals could mean the difference between making it to spring or not. It should be noted, however, that during terrible famines, such as the Great Famine of 1315, desperation could drive people to horrific extremes, such as eating shoe leather, tree bark, and in the most horrifying cases, cannibalism. But these were extreme cases, not the norm. In short, the medieval peasant winter diet was a pragmatic survival strategy. It was not about taste or comfort, but about turning calories into warmth, about eating heavy meals to keep the body's engine running in the constant battle against the cold. That was part of the essential to their survival kit, to get them through another cold night. Great. We've explored how medieval peasants used their diet as internal fuel to fight the cold. But even a belly full of stew and bread has its limits. When the cold still lurks and threatens to turn you into a peasant popsicle in your sleep, medieval peasants had to get creative to get a little extra heat while they slept. Before electric blankets, heating pads, or even fireplaces that worked all night, they relied on what you might call the unsung heroes of winter: the humble haybox and the cozy firestone. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it is, but the idea behind it is incredibly clever. The peasants would take a sturdy wooden box lined with straw. This box would then be used to keep the cooked food warm. Hot stew, hot porridge, just put it in the straw box and close it tightly. The straw acted as a great insulator, keeping the food warm for hours. It was essentially a medieval slow cooker. This allowed them to have a late-night snack without having to risk relighting the fire, a difficult and dangerous task on a winter night. But the peasants didn't stop at just keeping their food warm. They realized that if straw could keep the soup warm, it could also keep something even better warm: stones. This is where the heating stone came in. Before going to bed, someone, probably the unlucky child in the house after losing an argument, would pick up a flat stone and throw it into the center of the fireplace fire. The stone would be heated until it was almost untouchable, a fine line between being useful and causing third-degree burns. Once heated, they would use an old stick or tongs to pick it out. The stone, which still gave off a nice warmth, would be carefully wrapped in an old rag, a piece of cloth, or stuffed into a clay pot. The wrapped stone would then be placed under a layer of straw in the sleeping pad or at the end of the bed. It was essentially a medieval heating pad, ready to fight the chill rising from the frozen ground. Of course, using a heating stone came with its own risks. If you didn't wrap it properly, you risked starting a small fire in your own home. And if you accidentally dropped it on your foot, say goodbye to normal walking for a while. Winter injuries don't just come from slipping on ice. But when all went well, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that lasted for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you live in a half-frozen hut, luxury is defined as not waking up with ice drops hanging from your nose. In the great survival arsenal of the medieval peasantry in winter, a hot stone stuffed in straw might not sound glamorous. But for peasants clinging to any source of heat they could find, it was a small miracle. It helped them endure another cold night, in addition to other efforts like eating well, breathing through their noses, and sleeping together or with their animals for warmth. Wonderful. We have explored the individual and domestic survival strategies of medieval peasants in the face of the bitter winter, from clothing, shelter, sleeping, breathing, eating, to harnessing the heat of straw boxes and firestones. But even individual or domestic efforts had their limits. In their relentless battle against the bitter cold, medieval peasants had another important weapon: community and village support. You see, in the medieval world, no one survived the winter alone, unless they wanted to turn into a stylish frozen statue in January. Survival was not just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, noisy collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on each other. The peasant understood that, in the bitter cold of winter, a big fire and a pile of straw could only do so much. If your neighbor's fire goes out, you'll notice. If the smoke from Tom's fireplace suddenly stops billowing into the sky, someone will go check. Not just because Tom owes you a chicken, although that may be part of the reason, but because community means survival. Medieval villages had informal winter watchers. These were usually young or old people who couldn't work the fields, but who could keep an eye out for who was coughing too much, who hadn't been to the market for a few days, or whose house looked too quiet in the morning frost. They were like medieval neighborhood watchmen, only with more sheep and no reflective vests. If someone's fire went out, it was almost an emergency. A kind neighbor would rush over with a burning ember wrapped in a rag. Or better yet, they would invite the whole family into their crowded, smoky hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing 4 more people into an already cramped space, but it was a lot better than finding friends frozen in the spring. Community food stores also played a role. During particularly harsh winters, villages would sometimes pool their last remaining salted meats, grains, and dried vegetables. It was a grim form of charity. No one had much, but a few shared meals could be the difference between making it to spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped haul wood, share embers, and run emergency messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came. Sure, medieval villages weren't always sunny and warm hugs. Feuds and disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed someone's good cooking pot still occurred. But when the nights got deadly cold, old feuds were often quietly put aside. After all, survival was worth saving, because tomorrow, you might be the one who needed help in the freezing cold. Medieval communities were built not just on shared land, but on shared survival. They taught each other how to care for the sick, how to pool resources when food ran out, and how helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone else might be able to help you tomorrow. They lived on the understanding that no one could beat the winter alone. In the icy cold of winter, the village becomes one big, stubborn, sometimes dysfunctional, often humorous, but always determined family fighting to survive together. A pair of muddy boots, a burning ember, a frozen smile at every turn. So, alongside all the individual ingenuity, the heavy layers of clothing, and the huddled warmth of each other or their livestock, the community network was a crucial element in surviving the medieval winter. It was a testament to collective resilience, showing that even in the harshest of circumstances, people found ways to support each other to survive. Yes, we have gone through many practical survival methods that medieval peasants used to cope with the harsh winters, from keeping warm with clothes, houses, and body heat, to harnessing the heat of straw boxes and firestones, to community support. But when the wind howls like wolves outside the paper-thin walls and the fire shrinks to a limp ember, you need every advantage you can get, including a little divine intervention. In this relentless struggle for survival, medieval peasants relied on more than ingenuity, perseverance, or community strength. They also had an invisible but vital weapon: faith and prayer. For them, faith was not just a matter of Sundays or holy days. It was woven into every cold breath, woven into the hard daily grind of life. When physical exertion seemed insufficient and the threat of freezing to death loomed, prayer became an urgent and necessary act. Before crawling into the itchy layers of straw and wool under their sleeping mats, families would kneel together and offer hasty prayers. They did not ask for wealth or luxury. They asked for only the most basic things to survive: to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and toes still attached to their bodies in the morning. In this dangerous and uncontrolled world, saints became the first line of defense in winter. For example, Saint Erasm, same, was prayed to protect against throat diseases, a big concern when breathing in the biting cold air could make you cough violently. Saint Nicholas, known today as the bearer of gifts, was also prayed to protect families from sudden collapse during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions were also entwined in the daily struggle for survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the fireplace before bed, hoping it would ward off evil spirits, or at least mischievous drafts. Others marked their doors with holy chalk after certain holidays, asking for warmth and good fortune to find their way into their homes. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most devout woman in the village, are sometimes kept burning all night long. It is a fragile, flickering prayer against the cold darkness that claws at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer is complete without a few promises. Dear God, if you help us through this night, I vow to be kinder to my neighbors, including even those who steal our turnips. It was no abstract comfort. It was an urgent, everyday conversation, a testament to the tenacity with which hope was clung. In the smoke-filled rafters, interspersed with breathless prayers and hidden beneath itchy blankets, medieval peasants placed their simple, primitive hope. That hope, combined with their resilience and ingenuity, somehow got them through the endless and relentless winter nights, adding a layer of spiritual defense to their survival arsenal. Continue writing peasants' legacy and conclusion. Yes, we have been on a difficult journey to understand how medieval peasants faced the brutal winters, from small individual efforts to community support and the strength of faith. But when we look back at all the ingenuity, perseverance, and failures, what can we learn? What is their legacy? And the conclusion, what is the story of their winter survival? When we look back at medieval peasants, those mud-spattered, frost-bitten survivors, it's easy to see only their hardships, the chapped hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-filled huts. But beneath all that struggle lies something much more powerful, a legacy of raw ingenuity, stubborn resilience, and unshakable endurance. They had no central heating, no insulated coats, or comfortable foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of being told they'd survive the spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was a blueprint for resilience. Every straw-stuffed mattress, every fire that was kept ablaze overnight, every moss-filled crack in the wall is a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. In the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, they did not collapse. In desperation, instead, they adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the harsh lessons inculcated by each brutal winter. Their village communities were built not just on shared land, but on shared survival. They taught each other how to care for the sick, how to pool resources when food ran out, and how helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone else might be able to help you tomorrow. They lived on the understanding that no one could beat the winter alone. Their faith was also a kind of endurance. They wove in prayer into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope, a fragile, stubborn hope. Hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again. And somehow it did. Through their sacrifices, through the unglamorous victories of they survived one more night, one more storm, future generations evolved. Bit by bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters that their ancestors barely survived. This continued until warmth and comfort became common expectations, rather than distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are invisibly woven into the lives we lead now. Every warm blanket, every cozy home, every lazy winter evening sipping tea by the soft light of a lamp, all were the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to succumb to the cold. So next time the wind whistles outside your double-glazed window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Their story is a testament to the power of the human spirit. A powerful reminder that even in the harshest environments, the human spirit can adapt, cooperate, and persevere, leaving a lasting mark on future generations.